This is Keith Helwig from Cops, Corrections Videos. Today I'd like to talk about something which is unrelated to cops or corrections. I'd like to talk about veterans that I have known. You know, as I've gone through life, I've been around for a long time. I've met a lot of veterans. I've had a lot of veterans in my family. And I just want to express my appreciation to them individually as much as I can. Now, I'm sure there's some people who are friends and acquaintances that I've forgotten are veterans, and I apologize if I left your name off this list. But I do have a lengthy list of veterans that affected my life. First, of course, was my dad. My dad was in the Navy from 1942 to 1946. He never saw combat, but he was stationed on a destroyer tender that helped raise a fleet at Pearl Harbor. My brother Jim served 25 years in the Army and did retire from the Army. My father-in-law, Ray Cornuth joined the Air Force right at the end of World War II and spent his time stationed in Guam, ensuring that that part of the world was not going to be vulnerable again. My Uncle Arden was in the Air Force in World War II. He was a flight engineer. I have Uncle George. Uncle George served with the Marines in France during World War I. At the same time, his brother, Carl, my uncle, or great uncle, served in the Navy and was stationed in a destroyer off the coast of France. I had an Uncle Kenny, Uncle Kenneth Dexter. Uncle Kenny served almost 30 years in the Navy, starting before World War II and up to the start of the Vietnam War. Person that I used to carpool with, Bob Freidig. Everybody called Bob Freidig T-Bone. T-Bone was a veteran of World War II. T-Bone was a big guy. He was about 6'6", 300 pounds. He was called T-Bone because he was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he'd made a promise to himself that if he survived, he would eat a T-bone steak at least once a week. I don't know if he lived up to that promise, but he certainly had the size to show that he may have. Another is Art Schmidt. Art Schmidt was one of the first captains I had. Art Schmidt was a little guy. He was probably 5'4", 5'5", and he too served in World War II, though he didn't talk much about his experiences. Moving closer to the present, the Korean War. When I started working in corrections, I worked with people who were World War II vets, Korean vets, Vietnam vets. The two people that strike me from Korea are Charles Millard. He's one of the persons. Chuck was a forward artillery observer in the Army, and he served on the front lines in Korea. Another was Dick Becker. Dick Becker was a quiet, humble man, one of the nicest guys you would ever want to meet. In Korea, he'd been a Marine Scout sniper. He never talked of his experiences. He was on my sniper team when I commanded one for corrections, and I've got to say, he was one of the best shots that I've ever met. Ed Ellert. Ed Ellert was a man that I carpooled with. Ed was a veteran of the Navy, and during the Korean War, he was on an aircraft carrier. Ed was on a recovery team. It was his job to go get the bodies of pilots whose planes had crashed in Korea. I remember Ed telling the story of having breakfast with one of the pilots one morning. They were scrambled later that afternoon, and the next day Ed had to go pry his mangled body out of the wreckage of his cockpit. Then moving forward to the Vietnam War, I served with a number of people who were Vietnam War veterans. There was Harry Mulkenthien. Harry was the epitome of a hippie. He had an afro that went out to here. He had the Duck Dynasty beard. He was one of the best officers at the institution. Didn't talk a whole lot about his experiences in Vietnam, but he did have a Silver Star for bravery. Larry Bear. Harry and I started together. Larry was also a Marine in Vietnam and was wounded and sent home because of his wounds. A very good friend of mine who a year ago, passed away, John Mccrary. John Mccrary served 4 tours of duty in Vietnam. He spent 20 years in the Army. After he got out of the Army, he spent 30 years working with the state of Wisconsin. John and I were friends, and we got together for breakfast. And I was always trying to talk him into going on an honor flight, and he didn't want to go because he said he couldn't stand to see the names of the people he left behind. He finally agreed to go with me in 2021. He died of COVID in November of 2020. I have other friends. Glenn Hanson. Glenn served in, I believe he was in the Army right at the end of the Vietnam War. And he was stationed in Vietnam right at the end of the war. Harry Westfall. Harry was a member of the Air Force. He had the rough duty of being stationed in Hawaii as a military policeman for the Air Force. Barry Keipel. Barry Keipel is a man that started working shortly after I did. We've been friends for over 35 years now. Barry served in the National Guard. Jeffrey Faust. Jeffrey Faust is the epitome of a Marine. If you saw Jeffrey Faust today, he works in corrections, you would know just by his very bearing that he was a Marine. Jeffrey also served at least one tour of duty in the Middle East. Kelsey Kelly. Kelsey Kelly is a young lady that was one of my officers when I was a captain. Kelsey has been in the military probably since she was 18 years old. I don't know. She also served tours of duty in Afghanistan. I believe she continues in the Army today, and not full time. However, she is working to become a federal agent at this point in time. Brian Bednarik is an officer that I'd worked with, and he and I trained together, and he's now an officer for the state of Wisconsin, or for the city, and he served in the Middle East as well, as did retired Captain Ed Wenzel. Ed Wenzel had been over a couple of different times. I've never talked to Ed about his experiences, but I'm sure he has some pretty horrible stories to tell. Other people, Tom Hodge. Tom served in the National Guard. James Lewis served in the National Guard. You know, all of these people, whether they fought actively in a war, whether they were ever involved in a battle, whether they were military policemen, whether they were cooks, whether they were mechanics, they all served. Another name I just forgot, it just occurred to me, is Steve Bezzett. Steve Bezzett is a friend of mine who's had been a Louisiana police officer. He's retired now. Steve served more than 11 years in the Navy. Steve is a great guy. He's a good friend, and he was a good cop. And lastly, someone I'd like to thank, but will never have the chance to, is my 7th great-grandfather, Joseph Guerin. Joseph Guerin fought with the Continental Army under the command of George Washington during the Revolutionary War. If we look at the history of our country, I'm sure that each and every one of us has a number of veterans who affected their lives. On this day, Veterans Day, I would like you to reach out and thank them. I would like you to realize the sacrifices that they made. Even if they spent their time in Hawaii, if they spent their time in Louisiana, if they spent their time in the service, they were spending their time defending our freedom. Remember that, and this Veterans Day, and every Veterans Day from now on. This has been Keith Helwig from Cops Corrections Videos. Stay safe and watch your back.